Marhaba and welcome to Free Palestine Pod, the podcast. I'm Lama Bazzari.
And I'm Lina Hadi. Each week, we will bring you in-depth commentary from Palestine.
Let's talk Palestine. Today on the show, we welcome Noura Erakat, a well-recognized Palestinian-American activist, university professor, legal scholar, human rights attorney, and author of Justice for Some, Law and the Question of Palestine. Marhaba Noura, and welcome to Free Palestine Pod.
Marahib Lama, thank you for having me. Hi, Lina.
Let's talk Palestine. Let's start off with your thoughts on the worsening situation on the ground.
So right now on the ground, what we're witnessing is an escalation of Israeli violence. And I want to emphasize that this is an escalation of ongoing violence, of structural violence that characterizes the life of Palestinians and is actually, because of a Jewish supremacist regime, is the organizing principle of Israeli government and over Palestinian lives. The escalation reflects a desire to expand Israeli control, and it is a desire to push Palestinians further to surrender in response to a resurgence of Palestinian resistance. For folks who haven't been paying attention, this has taken on the feature of an extreme, grotesque amount of coercive force, including the siege of Shafat refugee camp, the siege of Nablus, the siege of Jenin, the imposition of curfews, the assassination, the extrajudicial executions of Palestinian young men, the asphyxiation of babies because of the indiscriminate use of tear gas, the kidnapping of children in the middle of the night from their homes in front of their families without due process at all. And so, one, this is incredibly concerning, as it should be, because it represents a kind of violence that any marginalized group lamenting patriarchy, racism, colonialism would fear the most. That what is the greatest fear of this kind of violence would be exactly what's happening to Palestinians. This all-out assault using advanced military and carceral technologies with the support and complicity of the almost entire international community against a stateless, besieged people to near silence. It's dystopian on many levels. Now, that said, I want to highlight that this, number one, is a continuation again of the structural violence that characterizes Palestinian lives. And number two, that this also reflects a moment of hope for Palestinians as well in two ways. Number one, it reflects the fact that Palestinians are organizing themselves, that there's an entirely new generation of Palestinians who have organized themselves into resistance forces that have overcome the political party structures that have historically characterized Palestinian lives and achieves a different kind of unity than we have seen before, right? And so there's hope on the ground that, yes, this is an extreme level of violence, but also Palestinians are resisting. Palestinians are resisting. And that resistance is not just an armed struggle, but that resistance is also in popular struggle. We saw that vividly when Uday Tamimi, after his operation in Shafat, was wanted by the Israeli army, and the young men in Shafat, in order to deter the army and to distract them, shaved their heads so that the army could not distinguish who was Uday and who was not. It was a moment where, as a Palestinian myself watching this, I could not have been more proud. Yeah. And it was a moment, it was a reminder to us, this is how we've survived. This is how we've survived for this long. It's this collective sacrifice and this spirit. It's the Palestinian mothers, it's the wives, it's the sistren who are also upholding the popular resistance. It's the mother of Ibrahim Nabulsi, who's, after her son was assassinated from the lion's den, who says to the world that all these young men are my children. All of them are my Ibrahim. His life and his spirit continues to live on in everyone. It's that resilience, that understanding that we are not simply individuals experiencing individual harm and violence and loss, but that we are a nation together, and that this is our losses and our wins are collective, and we continue together. So this moment is one of incredible concern and frustration, and simultaneously a tremendous amount of inspiration and hope, and a reminder of why Palestinians have survived for so long and why we are such an inspiration to all peoples fighting for freedom.
Noura, you recently mentioned in an exchange with the Free Palestine Pod that you have been studying Zionism. And we were wondering if you have read the PhD dissertation from our President Abbas that he wrote in Russia regarding the collaboration between the Zionists and the Nazis in 1936.
So I have not had that opportunity to read this dissertation, although I'm always ready to add to study and the work. So please do send that to me. My study of Zionism right now, I want to contextualize that. One, it's an ongoing study, right? It's a study that begins when we reject the false partition of the Green Line, and we reject, right, the frameworks of occupation and the two-state solution, and understand that this is not, this is not an Israel problem, right? It's not one of just the state and governance and poor governance. This is one about a racist ideology and a racist regime, right? A racist ideology that drives, it's the driving force, in the words of Fayez Sayegh, of Palestinian removal, an insatiable appetite for Palestinian territory and Palestinian dispossession. And so my research here begins anew and more deeply in the wake of the release of these apartheid reports by Human Rights Watch, by Amnesty, by Yesh Din, B'Tselem, and so on and so forth. Because in that moment, number one, putting aside the fact that these reports completely erased the work of Palestinian scholars, legal advocates, and thinkers that had been going on for decades, not one citation, right? Not one citation. Putting that to the side, the other issue and the problem that these apartheid reports had is they seem to characterize Israel's apartheid regime as a Frankenstein, that it became a racist regime because it failed to establish a Palestinian state and to limit its Zionist settler sovereignty to the 1949 armistice lines. And so here my intervention began to really challenge this notion, to say Israel did not become a Frankenstein, but it was established on the discriminatory racial concept of exclusion and racial supremacy. And so this is why I've been doing the study, and now I'm working with a fellow, Twaler, a third world approach to international law scholar, John Reynolds of Maynooth University in Ireland, who has studied emergency regimes in colonial contexts and with whom I've collaborated significantly. And we are now working on a text that wants to really confront Zionism, tentative title, confront Zionism, dismantling the apartheid of our time. And what I want to emphasize here for the listeners is that Palestinians in 1975 passed a resolution at the United Nations 3379 that condemned Zionism as a form of racism and racial discrimination. It was an amendment to the Decade Against Racism that was taking place at that time to delegitimize apartheid in South Africa. And what was advanced was a racial theory of Zionism that put it on par with apartheid, racism, xenophobia, colonialism, right? It delegitimized Zionism in that moment. The PLO rescinded this resolution in 1991 as a precondition for entering the peace process. And in the decades since, in these 3 decades plus since, Palestinian civil society, advocates, activists, organizers, fighters, filmmakers, speakers, right? Everyone has been re-scaffolding an analysis that has brought us back to a full confrontation of Zionism. And we saw that most significantly in the Unity Intifada, when advocates in the Manifesto of Dignity and Hope said that we have one enemy, and it's Zionism. But for that rescindment in 1991, right now, to say that Israel's an apartheid regime would be redundant, because we would already understand that Zionism is a racist regime. We wouldn't need another framework for it. And so, but it's not to take away from that, but it's also bringing us back into this moment. I understand I didn't answer your question about the collaboration between leading Zionists and Nazis, but I'll leave that to you to share with us, and to Abbas perhaps to explicate more on that.
I'd like your opinion on the 90-page plan, heavy restrictions on visitors, volunteers, professionals, spouses to enter and briefly or long-term stay within the West Bank. And clearly it's part of the regime's direct approach to control the population, the Palestinian population numbers.
Absolutely. It's not only another measure to control the population, but again, this is a continuation of an ethnic cleansing project, right? This is the latest iteration of an ethnic cleansing project. You know, the epitome of this exclusion project and ethnic cleansing is the Nakba, and then the enactment and the legislation of a law of return that allows Jews anywhere in the world to obtain nationality and citizenship and privileges within the state, and the exclusion and the prohibition of the right of return of Palestinian refugees who can trace their association, their original homes, their lands, their keys, generational legacies are excluded. So here we have, you know, exclusions that have iteratively taken place, all intent on reducing and eliminating the Palestinian population to achieve, right, an unequivocal Jewish demographic majority and Zionist settler sovereignty. And so other forms of that iteration that we know happen to be what's known as the confiscation of Palestinian passports, right? This happened to my family, where between 1967 and the early 2000s, hundreds of thousands of Palestinians had their identity cards revoked without any due process, in what's termed as the silent deportation. It was deportation without an opportunity to contest that. So that now my father, who was born in Abu Dis, has to travel to Palestine on an American passport as a tourist, right? And so another iteration happens to be the ban on family reunification, where Palestinians who fall in love with one another are not all eligible to obtain residency rights and citizenship rights under the, you know, apartheid regime because they are Palestinians. And so this is the latest iteration. We saw the exclusion. We've seen the systematic exclusion of Palestinians, activists who have been denied entry or have been deported, stamped with a 10-year stamp, held in detention, and then, you know, deported back without their luggage. And so all of us have prepared for that moment. You know, in each visit, I'm sure you can attest to this. If you also travel on a tourist visa, each visit either becomes, you know, the anxiety, will I get to enter? And then if you're allowed entry, the anxiety is upon you leave, is this in fact my last time? So this new policy is a manifestation, is just the next step in this. There are many ways, you know, to tactically resist it. And one of the ways that American activists are resisting it is to insist that Israel wants this waiver program for Israeli citizens to enter the United States on a waiver program. And, you know, activists in the United States are telling the US, deny that waiver program. You cannot allow Israelis to enter without a visa. And simultaneously, you know, Palestinian Americans who travel are not afforded that same, you know, privilege. So this is just, I'm not saying that this is the optimal way to advocate, but this is one strategic tactic, right? To use positionality, to use the current moment. And in fact, we're seeing a pushback on the waiver program and hopefully a repeal of this policy. But we need something far more solid than just this temporary, you know, pushing back of when this policy is going to be applied.
Noura, we're going to circle back to Zionism. We were wondering, why do you think that there are so many American and Anglo-Saxon Zionists that actually profess their Zionism and are so proud of being Zionists, including our other head of state, Joe Biden, amongst many, many others? But could you explain to me, in light of the 1975 vote at the UN, and given the fact that we are all aware that Zionism is a racist ideology, why are they out there, you know, waving the Zionist flag?
That's an excellent question, Lina. I mean, let's start by, you know, I want to go back to 1975 and put us in that context. Even in that moment, there was a stark divide between the third world, comprised of newly independent states that had been formally colonized, as well as national armed liberation struggles that were fighting for their freedom and their national independence at the time. There was a divide between those groups, basically the Black and brown peoples of the world, the majority of the world, right? And Western governments who were so livid about the resolution. In fact, they had the United States, Britain, France, and so on threatened to repeal their support for the entire Decade Against Racism if they did not remove, right, this amendment to the entire decade. And there was a pitched battle. Palestinians won in that moment, right? Palestinians won because at the General Assembly, it was this coalition that actually constituted an automatic majority within the General Assembly. So that this is historic, right? It's not that they've become more Zionist, it's that we have lost traction of making sure that the world understands that Zionism is a racist ideology. The US has been in support of Israel since it declared independence in 1948, supported its bid for recognition at the UN in 1949, and becomes its primary ally and imperial patron in 1967, when Israel demonstrates itself as a key Cold War asset in the Middle East, when it defeats, right, several Arab armies in a matter of 6 days. And so at that point, we see the Johnson administration, one, shift from a policy of detente, of arming, Arab monarchies, repressive Arab monarchies, and Israel, and instead shift to just making sure that Israel has a qualitative military edge over the entire Middle East, as well as ensuring that it will not be held to any kind of international accountability at all, right? And we can discuss that further. But so here, this is a really critical moment because this explains the US attachment to Israel and Zionism on a geopolitical level, why media reiterates the centrality of Zionism, why there is this almost apology for Israel on all levels in the framing of it as a David against an Arab Goliath, which could not be less true, right? It's this geopolitical order, but it's more than just geopolitical, right? Because the Cold War has ended and yet this attachment has not. The attachment also goes deeper because of a way that the US has internalized culturally and socially Zionism as a narrative of liberation. And this was done through text, has been done through media, this has been done through film, which creates an attachment to Israel so uncritically, and one that's also serving for Americans because the US itself is a settler colony. Any critique of Israel would require a self-critique of us as a settler colony, continuing our expansion and our confiscation of native lands, not just at the Dakota Access Pipeline for it, not just at the XL Pipeline, not just in Hawaii, which is occupied territory, and the Kanaka Maoli's ongoing struggle, but also against, right, Black communities who remain a racial subjugated class. There are entwinements and a commitment to Israel that far exceed just our geopolitical alignments, and doing the work, right? Doing the work of creating cracks in these frameworks is the work of what activists have been doing, organizers, for many, many decades. My elders and ancestors, my generation, and now the generations that are coming up after us are continuing to do this work. And although we haven't necessarily shifted it on the ground, we are making significant cracks. And I think that we should be heartened by that and continue.
In 2019, the ICC prosecutor announced the conclusion of their preliminary examination of the situation in Palestine, but yet official investigation is yet to materialize. Why does prosecuting Israel continue to elude us as Palestinians since the Nakba?
I'm sorry, I'm not laughing because I'm happy about this, but it's more of this, it's the absurdity. It's the absurdity of this kind of impunity that Israel has been afforded. But here I want to also contextualize, because Palestinians are part of a broader struggle in the world. We are in alignment with all peoples who are fighting, right? We are in alignment with the Uyghurs who are fighting against the Chinese regime. We are in alignment with African Americans who are fighting against the US racial regime. We are in alignment with Hawaiians. We are in alignment with, right, Navajo and Lakota peoples, and so on and so forth, right? This is really about the paradox of international law and its relationship to power. And so who gets prosecuted, and how do we achieve accountability, right? We're in alignment with Iraqis. We're in alignment with Afghanis who are in this struggle. And so here, just a note on that paradox and the way that it applies to Palestinians in the ICC is that the ICC itself is a very political tribunal. It is not a derivative of the General Assembly, but it was created by a treaty, the Rome Statute in 1998, right? And it's created on the heels, it's a decades-long vision, but it's created literally on the heels of massacres in Rwanda and the Balkans. And it intends to eliminate crimes against humanity. It wants to criminalize war crimes. It wants to, criminalize genocide. This is about the international community coming together to understand that we are greater than the sum of our parts. The Rome Statute itself, however, and I draw on the work of Professor Kamari Maxine Clark, enshrines white supremacy. It absolves the wrongs and the war crimes and the crimes against humanity that have been committed by colonial powers, right? It includes in Article 17 a complementarity clause that basically says that a country that can prosecute itself will not be subject to the jurisdiction of the ICC, thereby basically absolving all the powerful states that have their own judiciaries, and condemns, the least developing states, and has created this outcome that we have now, that since its inception in 2002, right? That's when the treaty had sufficient parties to the Rome Statute, so it created the ICC in 2002. In the 20 years that have passed, the ICC has only prosecuted African heads of state and Slobodan Milosevic. And it's caused a number of African states to actually withdraw from the treaty altogether, right? And so here now the ICC is between a rock and a hard place. If it doesn't prosecute Israel, it basically condemns itself and exposes, it exposes its futility, right? And how it's subject to power. And if it does prosecute Israel, it's also in a hard place, because then its largest contributors, including the United States, will cease to support it. And so this is a moment, this is a test for everyone. Now, for Palestinians, we need to not place any hope in the ICC, but instead think like movement attorneys. How can we use this bid at the ICC? How can we use this massive amounts of documentation and research that's been done, right? And this controversy that the ICC is creating, in order to run laps across capitals and within grassroots campaigns to hold Israel to account in a court of public imagination. And this is the opportunity that we as Palestinians are missing, and one that I attribute, frankly, to the failure of the official Palestinian leadership to utilize the law more strategically and even to be accountable. And its bid, as far as I'm concerned, was a bid to, save its legitimacy in the eyes of Palestinians more than it was actually to advance the cause of Palestinian freedom.
Noura, you mentioned that you are studying transnational solidarity. And we were wondering, why was the United States and Europe and actually the world so motivated and so successful with the Ukrainian crisis? And yet the Palestinians have been facing a very similar crisis since 48. I mean, explain it to me.
Well, Lina and Lema, I'm sure you can explain it to us. And so I received the question as a...
Sorry, I'm sorry. We want, with all due respect, we really want your expert opinion, and we really appreciate it. And so definitely.
I appreciate that. I appreciate you. But I mean, I do want to say, unfortunately, it's a bit obvious, is unfortunately what it is that, what explains this has been what's revealed to us, which is racism. It's a racism. Because, I had imagined that perhaps because the United States was absolving itself of its own crimes as a settler colony, as a racial regime, that perhaps because of that, Americans didn't really have a literacy to understand colonialism and settler colonialism. So when I travel, I travel to Portugal, I travel to other parts of, the world, people understand immediately what I mean when I talk about it. I don't have to explain it. So for so long, I had thought, Americans lack that literacy. And then Russia occupies Ukraine. And suddenly we see, oh no, Americans have a deep literacy and understanding of occupation, of resistance, of popular struggle, of empire, of solidarity. And so what explains then this kind of inability to understand it when we see Palestinians in resistance? And it's racism. And they've told us as much. Media has communicated to us that these are blue-eyed, blonde-haired people that look like us, right? Who are trying to cross the border and have been denied entry. They have told us very explicitly, right, that when they see Ukrainians building Molotov cocktails, that this is good. This is, the weak against the strong, and they're using the means at their disposal. So what happens when we do it? Well, we're immersed. Number one, we're immersed in a very Zionist society, where Zionism has been so deeply embedded as to be naturalized and invisibilized. Number one. Number two, we're also battling against against Islamophobia, which has constructed the Muslim body, which then subsumes the Arab body and the Palestinian body, as inherently violent, as inherently savage, in need of civilization, right? So that even our use of force in resistance, right, revolutionary violence, cannot be read as anything but criminal and terroristic, right? So we are fighting against all of these tropes. And in order to overcome them, really, there's no way we can overcome it by ourselves. We have to overcome it through solidarity with other peoples who are having the same struggle and face very similar challenges in their bids for freedom, in their struggles for freedom, but who also, because of those struggles for freedom, can see us vividly, right? So Black Palestinian solidarity is so powerful because what American Blacks told us in Ferguson, in Baltimore, right, in Chicago, in Oakland, is that we see you in this struggle because we share a very similar struggle against state violence. One where racism and colonialism combine to do three things, right? It makes the aggressor, the powerful aggressor, into the victim, so that US and Israel can both claim self-defense. Two, it blames the victim for the harm done to them, right? If only Palestinian mothers loved their children, they wouldn't die, right? If only Black people didn't kill other Black people, they would be more safe. If only they protested in a better way, if they were better victims. It's this victim blaming trope that they aspire to. And the third is basically to say that we got what we deserved, right? And are relegated to these conditions, and then don't have resistance or other forms of resistance at our disposal.
Excellent. Thank you.
Just a final question. Can you share any updates on Ahmed Erakat?
Absolutely. I mean, it's just so hard, We do this work. I've been doing it my entire adult life. And I've been affected, but I've never been affected like this close to home, and where it was on full display. I mean, it was the combination of it coming home and then the intensity of everybody watching it that has just made it such a difficult place. And okay. So an update on Ahmed Erakat. As the audience may remember, my cousin Ahmed was gunned down at an Israeli checkpoint that separated Abu Dis from Bethlehem, two Palestinian cities, when his car experienced a malfunction, and immediately two Israeli officers shot him 6 times above the waist in 2 seconds. In 2 seconds, according to forensic architecture, which recreated the scene using 3D imaging and shadow technologies and available footage. Immediately, Ahmed was declared a terrorist for a would-be car ramming. The car was taken without any investigation. His body has been confiscated without an autopsy. There has been no accountability to Israel, and he continues to be held. Right? This was in June 2020. He continues to be held in a freezer, Forensic Institute at Tel Aviv University. And the justification that Israel gives, aside from the lies and the propaganda that he's a terrorist, is that they want to exchange his body for Israeli soldiers' bodies held by Hamas. And this is completely unacceptable. Number one, just the idea of withholding the body at all and using it as ransom is a violation of all norms and precedent. And number two, it even, violates this idea of when prisoners are exchanged, prisoners of war. Ahmed is a civilian, right? This wasn't a combatant where Israel can do this. And yet Israel now holds Ahmad's bodies along with the bodies of several dozens other Palestinians, absolutely without accountability and with continuing impunity. And obviously we as the family are continuing to advocate for the release, have used petitions, right? Have appealed to 5 special rapporteurs at the United Nations, have used, media campaigns and so on and so forth, have filed petitions within the Israeli Supreme Court. And those Supreme Court outcomes have basically told us that Israel, this is the discretion of the military and the civilian government, that the judiciary cannot be involved, and have condemned him to this inhumane, ongoing condition.
Horrific.
Yeah, very much. For all of us. For all of us, as in a result of our advocacy, which was very fervent, we brought a lot of attention to it, and we managed to lobby 6 senators in the United States, including now Vice President Kamala Harris, to make phone calls on our behalf to the Israeli government. We mobilized the Erakat family in the United States, in these 3 states and 6 senators. One of the senators actually wrote a letter, so thus establishing a paper trail. And in response, then Defense Minister Benny Gantz made the policy even more harsh and said, not only will we continue to withhold these bodies, we are going to dig up the bodies of other buried Palestinians in order to hold them hostage. Yeah, you can't make this up. You can't make this up. And yet the failure to recognize how bad it is really the internalization of Zionism that basically renders Palestinians as the sacrificial lambs to atone for Western, guilt, and a failure to really combat anti-Semitism. Zionism is not the answer or the antidote to anti-Semitism. Zionism is a violent, racist ideology that condemns us to a number of militarized garrison states, that makes our existence mutually exclusive. And the first and foremost victims of it are Palestinians, but we're not the only ones.
Thank you very much for joining us today on Free Palestine Pod.
You are really an inspiration to so many, and everyone is so proud of you. And keep doing what you're doing, and we're all in this together. And we need to stick together. We all need to be good to each other. We need to come up with a solid, united Palestinian front, and that's what Lema and I are trying to do here.
I love it. And I love the way that you're creating a connective tissue between us. And I love the work that you both do. And so I'm honored to be here with you.
Thank you for joining us this week on Free Palestine Pod. Subscribe, like, rate, and review wherever you listen to podcasts, and follow us on Instagram, YouTube, and Twitter.
And be sure to come back next week for a new episode of Free Palestine Pod. Let's talk Palestine.